Oh, there's the big clock.
Good evening, everybody. I am delighted this evening to welcome our IOP fellow, Alfredo Cochado, and his friends and subjects of his new book for a discussion about, as he likes to say, 4 friends, 2 countries, and 1 journey, an exploration of where they, as Mexican-American immigrants, fit in America. Alfredo has been with us for a month now and has made a strong impression on the IOP and I think on the entire campus, if not the city. So we have been really enjoyed having you here. It's sad to see you go, but you're going out with a flourish. So before our panel is formally introduced, I just have a few announcements. Next week, we have our final 2 events. On Wednesday, May 31st, the IOP's student-led event committee, International Policy Program, is hosting the New York Times East Africa Bureau Chief Jeffrey Gettleman, who will talk about his experiences reporting in the Horn of Africa through years of famine and conflict. That'll be at the Seminary Co-op. And our final program of the year on Friday, June 2nd, will be a conversation between David Axelrod and Republican Senator Tom Cotton at the Max Palevsky Cinema. I believe that's at noon on Friday. You can find out more about our events at our website, politics.uchicago.edu. After the conversation, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand, and someone will bring a microphone to you. As usual, we'll give priority to the first 3 questions to students. And please keep your questions as questions. They should end in a question mark. Please silence your phones. The restrooms are on the lower floor. And without much further ado, to formally introduce our speakers is Michelle Shim. Michelle is a first year in the college, majoring in economics and English. This year, she was a Fellows Ambassador to Bruce Reed in the fall, and she is the team leader for Alfredo this quarter. She's been incredible. Our Fellows Ambassadors support the on-campus experience for our fellows each quarter, and they also, I think, have a good time as well. So please join me in welcoming Michelle to the podium.
Thank you for your kind words. Good evening. In such an era of uncertainty under Trump, we keep returning to the same echoing questions. How do Mexican Americans fit into the American narrative? And what will border pressures and immigrant anxieties amount to? And is coexistence possible with mounting tensions? Here to share their stories and hopefully address some of these concerns are 5 hugely inspiring figures: Alfredo Corchado, Kenneth Trujillo, Primitivo Rodriguez, David Suro, and Angela Kucherga, our moderator for tonight. Alfredo is a current fellow at the Institute of Politics, and I've had the honor of serving as team leader of his Fellows Ambassador team with Nicole, Olivia, and Ella. And words cannot express the amazing experiences we've had with him in just 1 very short month, and we really hope he's enjoyed his time here as well. Alfredo is an award-winning journalist covering border tensions, immigration, drug wars, and Mexico's democratic challenges. He is currently the Mexico City Bureau Chief of the Dallas Morning News and Director of the Borderlands Program at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. Alfredo is also the author of Midnight in Mexico and is working on his 2nd book, Shadows at Dawn. Kenneth Trujillo, on the left, is one of the top lawyers in the country. He has served as city solicitor of Philadelphia, as well as assistant U.S. attorney, and was a 2014 candidate for mayor in Philadelphia as well. Kenneth was also the former secretary, treasurer, and first vice chair of the National Council of La Raza, the largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the U.S., and was the former chair of the board of directors of Congreso de Latinos Unidos. Primitivo Rodriguez is a human rights activist who, before returning to Mexico, was a community and political organizer in Chicago and Philadelphia. Primitivo has worked tirelessly to form binational organizations that protect the civil rights of Mexicans on both sides of the border, and is a firm believer in giving Mexican Americans in the U.S. the right to participate in Mexican elections. He is also, according to Alfredo, an excellent dancer. David Suro is an expert in Mexican cuisine and spirits and is the owner of Los Catrines in Philadelphia, one of the finest Mexican restaurants that the U.S. has to offer. David even has his own premium small batch tequila brand, Siembra Spirits, and recently established the Siembra Azul Foundation, a nonprofit that provides medical and educational assistance to Mexican migrant workers. David has also served as a founding member of Philadelphia's Mexican Cultural Center. And last but definitely not least, Angela Cocherga is a director of the Borderlands Bureau of Cronkite News at Arizona PBS and is a professor at the Cronkite School of Journalism. She has covered the southwest border and interior of Mexico for more than 25 years, reporting on drug violence, arms trafficking, and immigration, as well as the economic, political, and cultural influences of Latinos in the U.S. So with that, please join me in welcoming our speakers and their story of 4 friends, 2 countries, and 1 journey. Thank you.
Before we start the program, I just want to thank the IOP. It's been an incredible experience, and I mean that sincerely. I came here, I wasn't really sure how much. I'm in the last stages of writing this book, so I was a little worried. But once I got here, I just basically threw myself into the program, the students, and I walk away with incredible experiences that maybe we can talk about later. And how meeting people like Michelle and Ella and our future politician here, Olivia, Nicole, has inspired me and given me much hope for the future. They came up with the line in taking back their country and making America really great again. So thank you for that. Alicia, Stephen, and many of the people from IOP, Ashley, Christine, everyone who's made this possible. I see this tonight as sort of a let's test this thing out. You're the focus group. This is the first time that we come together as 4 friends. I didn't think 30 years ago on a wintry night in Philadelphia that we would be here 30 years later at the University of Chicago, the heartland of the great Mexican migration. Some people call it the last great Mexican migration. Emilio, thank you for putting some warning here that we should put a pause on it and not call it the last great Mexican migration. I see Brody here too. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I mean, there's a lot of students that I met, David, others who I met while I was here, but I told these guys we might have at least 4 people, the 4 ambassadors, so it's great to see such a great crowd. I'd like to maybe kick it off by giving you a sneak peek into the book, and this is we'll get into how we met later, but this is kind of a portion of chapter 4 that kind of puts the book in context. Ken spoke Spanish, far from perfect, but we admire his effort. Mine wasn't great either, so I felt comfortable with him. At times he sounded Puerto Rican, and I initially thought he was from the island. I later discovered he wasn't even from Mexico at all, but had been born and raised in New Mexico. David strolled over again and introduced himself to Ken. He poured him a drink too, happy that he had now met 3 other homesick souls. I should put this in context. We met on the same night in Philadelphia in February of 1987. At our insistence, he poured one for himself too. With our shot glasses full, we looked at each other and tried to size one another. We quickly adopted an old-world tradition that's become our own, looking into each other's eyes when saying cheers, salud. In that brief moment, we sensed a common heartbreak. We looked at one another, captivated by the music, cuisine, the conversation in Spanish, and our own shared roots. We began to discover something about ourselves, thousands of miles away from the southern border. Whatever the case, the 4 of us had nowhere else to go that night. It was late, almost midnight, and the tables were mostly clear of guests. Pour after pour, the tequila bottle became lighter, and we became louder, as we began to pick apart every aspect of the changes sweeping the country. At times, as we dug deeper into the currents reshaping America, we felt left out of the larger transformation underway. Looking back, and with the exception of Ken, we were the sons of a failed revolution in Mexico, living in the city of Philadelphia that embodied the best of a revolution, where the nation's founders drew up a constitution that would be the envy of the world for centuries over. We were testing the tolerance of a city built in 1691 by William Penn, an aristocrat turned rebel rouser who saw in his new land holdings a haven for refugees fleeing religious persecution and immigrants looking to reinvent themselves. David spoke of his passion for food and ways to seduce Americans with Mexican culinary, culture, and spirits. Quiet power, a term I would later learn. Ken talked about judicial justice, a vision for a more equal and inclusive country. Primo only hinted at what he was up to, secretly organizing workers on both sides of the border and devising efforts to empower Mexicans in the United States. I just wanted to go home, find a way back to the border or to the Mexico of my childhood, hopefully as a foreign correspondent for a big U.S. newspaper. But the competition was stiff, all seemed like a pipe dream. Many years later, as I look back on that evening, something else was forged that would withstand the passage of time, distance, survive our complexities, arguments, differences, as if we were destined to come together that night and in that moment. Four strangers bound for the unknown, unhinged from our old comfort zones, embarking on a chaotic journey, new immigrants, most of us, three from prominent immigrant sending states in Mexico, Jalisco, Michoacan, and Durango. Ken, the New Mexican, was well on his way into the mainstream of American, looking for his Mexican roots along the way. That night, we began a conversation that has lasted nearly 30 years, turning on a fundamental and deeply personal question. How do we, David, Primo, and I, learn to coexist as Americans without losing our identity as Mexicans? In Philadelphia, I was strikingly aware of my identity. I was not just a reporter the way I was in El Paso. I was a Mexican transplant, fearful that a new society would wash away everything left of who I was. I also wonder if Americans were also fearful that the newcomers were invading their cultural space, identity, history. How much of this battle was inevitable, and how much of this was just in our heads? Outside, the quiet night slept. Trucks plowed piles of snow, clearing Locust Street between Broad and Rittenhouse Square, exposing all that was left on a wintry darkness, four strangers searching for the shadows at dawn.
Thank you, Alfredo.
So it worked out. This is a focus group.
Worked out great. Thank you, Alfredo. And thank all of you for being here this evening. It was really a rare treat to hear an excerpt from the book that is in the works right now. He's in the throes of finishing it. And it's a rare treat to have these four friends who met in Philly in the flesh here with us. We're going to try and recreate that evening and that conversation that started 30 years ago and really make this more of a dialogue. They're going to be talking to each other. I'll be guiding the conversation, and there will be time for you, we hope, to ask your questions. We'll leave plenty of time and to engage in this discussion. There's a lot to talk about, but let me start by asking, why Philly? I mean, none of you are originally from Philly. Why did you meet there, and what did you think of each other when you came together that wintry night? Whoever wants to start.
You should start.
Ken
Trujillo.
Well, for me, it was easy. I went to Philadelphia to go to law school, and the reason, though, that we met in 1987, I graduated law school in 1986, and originally planned to go either back to New Mexico or Colorado, but decided I would stay in Philadelphia for a couple of years because I wanted to have an East Coast experience at a big law firm, and so that's why I stayed. I expected that by 1988, 89, I'd be back in Denver or Albuquerque. But 1987, I met these guys, and later got my wife to come from Albuquerque to Philadelphia, and I'm still in Philadelphia.
What you think of us?
Well, look, we're talking about a 30-year conversation. Before the night's over, you're going to realize why that conversation has taken 30 years. It's because we won't stop talking, right? We've had, and this conversation, this friendship, I think has been really, it's special. By the way, I also happen to think that if you think about, you leave here tonight and you go and meet up and with a couple of friends or 2 or 3 friends, and your life over the next 30 or 40 years involves the same pathways that we've had, you consider yourself to have a blessed life. So I consider myself lucky. That's what I think about you.
David, why tequilas? Yeah.
Well, probably I was living in Cancun. I'm from Guadalajara originally, but I migrate within the borders of Mexico to Cancun. And I was very lucky to find a job in the restaurant industry. And I totally fell in love of the restaurant industry. And I worked for a very successful group of restaurants. And so it was definitely not the weather what it brought me to Philadelphia from Cancun. It was my wife is from Philadelphia. From my first marriage, and we were expecting our older son, David Jr., and we decided to move to Philadelphia just during the pregnancy, but with all the intentions to go back to Cancun, where I have a very decent job. But being in Philadelphia, I started to work during those 6-7 months that we were planning to stay. I decided to start to work in a restaurant. I want to see a different perspective and operation of a restaurant in the United States. And it became a great challenge when I learned the misconceptions about Mexican food. And I find a niche for the ideas that they were growing every day. And we present a business plan to a small group of a community group that was helping minorities. I had no idea what a minority was. I was taller than most of them. I said, why they call it minority? But I was very lucky to come across this group of people that guide me on how to start my own business. And we opened a restaurant, and after a year, and then, one lucky day, these guys walking into the restaurant, and it was a very interesting moment because just crossing few words, it was an immediate click between the 4 of us. It was not easy to find people in Philadelphia to share the same vision and the same culture. So since then, I really mean this, I don't think that I would made it where I am without the guidance of these guys. They were fundamental for me to understand what would be, the journey that I was starting back in 1987. So what I think about these guys, well, they are my mentors in many, many ways.
Yeah. You were in Chicago before you went to Philadelphia, correct?
Yeah, I used to live here in Chicago. By the way, you'll be hearing that I do not have at all an accent when speaking English. And that's because I had 2 great, outstanding teachers of English, Henry Kissinger and Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's why there is no accent. I have no accent whatsoever. I moved from Chicago to Philadelphia.
You were a student here.
I was a student here at the University of Chicago. I came to university in 1977 and left the university 5 years later. Worked in Chicago with the American Friends Service Committee, where Raul, my very good friend, who's here, was also working. And I went to Philadelphia because somebody told me that it was only 2-hour ride from Washington. and an hour and a half ride from New York. So I said, well, that's a pretty good place. 2 hours to Washington and an hour and a half to New York. The American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, you might have heard about them, have their main office in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, Brotherly Love, founded Philadelphia and Pennsylvania by William Penn. Quakers keep the very spirit of nonviolence, peaceful behavior all the time. That's why I'm also very peaceful, as Alfredo and David and Trujillo know about it. When I met Alfredo at an Indian restaurant, later on we went to Tequilas, where I met David and Trujillo. Well, we'll be saying some things about each other. I sort of like them. And I said, well, perhaps later on with more tequila, things will be better. So to begin with, that's why I moved to Philadelphia to work for the American Friends Service Committee.
I came to Philadelphia in '87, and I remember calling. I was desperate because I didn't really want to go to Philly. I had an offer to go to the New York Times, and my editor kept telling me, I think Philadelphia is a better fit. It's a bureau, it's smaller, they'll pay more attention to you, they'll help you develop, they'll help you grow, etc. But I was really desperate. I was scared. Most of my family had, our migration route was Durango, El Paso, and California. And so going to the East Coast was sort of like, like going into a different planet. But I called this friend of mine. I said, I'm going to Philadelphia. Do you know anyone who speaks Spanish in Philly? And he said, there's a guy who's a Jesuit-trained human rights activist. His name is Primitivo Rodriguez. You should look him up. And I thought, when I met Primo, I thought, communist, socialist. But we started meeting on Saturdays at an Indian restaurant in Philadelphia, right near the University of Pennsylvania. I think after 3 meetings, we thought we have to try something different. And
we went to an Indian restaurant because of the spicy food.
Right.
We still haven't met David in order to get real hot Mexican chili, salsa. But the Indian food was pretty...
The Indian food was pretty good. It was pretty spicy. But he says, I read that there's a Mexican restaurant in Philly called Tequilas. And I go, well, with a name like that, Tequilas is probably part of a chain, maybe Chi-Chi's franchise or something. But I thought, what do we have to lose? So we ended up taking off that afternoon to Tequilas on Locust Street in downtown. And we walked in, and the first thing that struck me was the music that was playing. It was Mecano, and there was some music, Miguel Bosé, etc. So I thought, well, this is not that these guys are Mexicans, Miguel Bosé, Mecano, but it felt like authentic, felt like, it was genuine. And then I looked at this guy. David was behind the bar, and I'm thinking, this guy's trying to look Mexican. He's probably Italian. He had shaggy long hair, mustache, And I kept thinking, and so Primo and I were taking delight in just poking at this, It's the way se cree mexicano, he thinks he's Mexican, blah, blah, he's Italian. And then the food came out, and it really tasted like home. Tasted like real Mexican food. It wasn't Tex-Mex. And at one point I said, we got to meet the owner. We have to find out. We cussed a lot because I was also a little pissed that he had Che Guevara, he had Pancho Villa, Galeano, ¿quién más? Zapata, Fidel Castro. He had a whole shrine. And I thought,
El esqueleto.
And I'm covering, stories for the Wall Street Journal, and I become really cynical. thinking another capitalist pig taking advantage of our culture, you know. I really want to meet the owner here. And David comes up, he says in Spanish, jóvenes, un placer tenerlos aquí, blah, 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 me llamo David Suro. I'm like, holy shit. And that's how we met. So we met that night, and it was interesting that after dinner, Primo and I were about to leave, and David, like a goalie, went for the door and just stopped us and said, please have a tequila. Please stay for a round. I mean, what we're going, you know, it's a weekend. What we're going to do in Philadelphia on a February night, and he said it's on me. So we ended up staying. Ken was this is amnesty time. You were doing with
There was a drive and a bill in the Pennsylvania legislature to make English the official language of Pennsylvania. And so that's Raul Izaguirre, who was the CEO of the National Council of La Raza, had come in to do a TV taping, and I was the spokesperson for the Pennsylvania
still
opposition.
caked in makeup.
No, I usually wear makeup.
But that's how we met. That's why we ended up in Philadelphia. As I said earlier, I thought Ken was a Puerto Rican. I thought he was probably a Puerto Rican activist. Thought David was Italian. I thought Primo was a communist from Mexico City.
One out of
running
three.
Away. And we started this conversation.
When Alfredo thought Ken was from Puerto Rico, he sort of started dancing salsa. Trujillo got up and started dancing jarabe tapatio. So like, the only authentic guy who could dance jarabe tapatio was David.
That's not
from
true.
Guadalajara.
Not even with the 2 bottles of tequila I can dance.
Bottle of tequila.
Well, the book looks at these key eras of your friendship, the 80s, the 90s, post 9/11 to the present. So the 80s were critical. You mentioned amnesty, IRCA, but explain to people what was happening then, both politically but professionally. For all of you were building your careers, building your lives, and your work was, your cause Primo, was taking shape. So who wants to jump in and kind of talk about why were the 80s so transformative?
Well, I think, and Michelle teed this off earlier really well, but I think 1986 was when the last comprehensive immigration bill was passed, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which allowed for, and that was also the bill in which folks started talking about legalization as amnesty. And so there was it was huge because it happened under who? President Reagan was the president when that passed. It was interesting. We all had different perspectives of this. As Alfredo said, we're all immigrants. I'm not a recent immigrant. My family's been in northern New Mexico since the 1600s. So in the late 1848, 49, we became accidental immigrants by the border being changed on us. But so immigration was not a huge issue for me personally, except that my favorite law school class was immigration law. And so I had an interest in immigration law when I first started practicing and did a little bit of that. But it was a huge issue especially for Mexican Americans, and that's when that was really a central point of many of our conversations. And
3.1 million people were legalized in that era.
For us, unfortunately, we don't have enough Mexican community in Philadelphia. I wish that happened a few years after, because our team just started to get together. Most of my coworkers were U.S. Citizens. Only few people were able to benefit from that amnesty.
And that's actually, I think, an interesting point is Philadelphia today is about 14% Hispanic, the city of Philadelphia. Back then, in the 1980s, it was less than 5%. I remember looking at they used to have phone books back then, and I remember I was the only Trujillo in the phone book when I first got telephone service.
I never looked at the phone book. I didn't want to depress myself.
And I was the only Rodriguez on that time. Now it's like you have a special phone book for the Rodriguez, Garcias, and all that. So.
No, but my thing was, at the time, was covering immigration. I mean, the explosion nationwide was incredible. It was no longer just, again, the Southwest, but it was people from the Southwest leaving for the East Coast. Obviously, the Midwest had already been populated, but there were a lot of new communities that were coming up. And so part of my job was following the great migration that was headed everywhere. And I think one of the mistakes that the four of us made, or at least the three of us made, was thinking that we were the only Mexicans in the area. We later find out that there was a whole big Mexican population in Kennett Square, the mushroom capital of the world. Many people from Guanajuato, many people from Michoacan. A woman who played a very key role in trying to get the right tequila for David, a taster, was a nun who was living in Philadelphia for 60-something years. And so we slowly started realizing there's been this community here for a long time, and I don't know do you want to tell a story about the nun?
But then one of the things that I really enjoyed on the tequila and agave spirits culture, it's not just the spirit himself, but the culture that's around the spirit, the history, the people. And through a research that I was doing of the origins of the producers that I work with in the highlands in Arandas, Jalisco, I find out that it was a group of nuns that escaped during the Cristiada, during the war of the Cristiada. And so I went and I asked two of my friends on the Catholic Church, by any chance, this group of this congregation of nuns? And, oh yeah, sure, they are in so-and-so. There's still few left. So I went to this convent. We were a cluster nuns, knocked the door, and this little lady, sí, ¿qué quiere? ¿Quién es? And, we became great friends. This lady she was in her 90s, and she was able to tell us the stories from the Mexico that she left behind, from the Cristiada. It was amazing. It was amazing. You guys have the opportunity to meet Sister Guadalupe. And it was probably one of the first Mexicans, to establish that group, that congregation in Philadelphia, in the city of Philadelphia.
She would ask you for soil from...
Oh, yes. So every time I go to Arandas, says, Sister, what I can bring from Arandas? I say, well, red soil. The soil of Arandas is very unique. It's this red color, deep red color. Bring me a bottle with red soil and a bottle of tequila. She became one of my best partners when we were sipping and tasting tequila. Yeah, that was Sister Guadalupe. Yeah.
Something that happened also during the 80s was the debt crisis, huge debt crisis for Mexico, middle 80s. Later on, by the end of the 80s, when President Salinas, the new president of Mexico, was in power, he started with Bush Sr. the talks about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So Mexico went from a very heavy debted country with lots of immigrants coming to the States because of the economic financial crisis to talks about a partnership with the United States, NAFTA. So those things also change journalism, isn't it? And Mexico was already known for a drug producing and mostly a drug sort of road to drugs to come to the United States. Right. What was about journalism? Weren't you covering those issues?
That's when you went back. You went to Mexico, the binational years.
Yeah, I think in the 90s, I think we all became a little binational, if you will. I achieved my dream of going. I've really becoming a correspondent for a newspaper, a big newspaper, the Dallas Morning News. And Primo had just left. I think you had left 4 or 5 months earlier, and you were working on democratic issues in Mexico. Ken, you ended up becoming an international lawyer And David obviously was looking.
I was still getting people fat and drunk. I just have to. This was a very interesting part of the of NAFTA and Philadelphia. I remember Primo used to ride to the restaurant after work around 8:30, 9 o'clock, and he used to ask me for the cordless phone, and I'd walk into a corner of the restaurant and take the little antenna of the phone and talk to. I can't. It's disclassified information now. That's too long. But I remember conversations with the high-level Mexican members of the Mexican government talking about NAFTA. A couple times, the conversations we had that evening. Next day, there was on the front page of the New York Times. The conversation that this guy was having with politicians in both sides of the border. Yeah, that was.
Well, I was able to talk high-level politicians after 3-4 shots of tequila. You can have tequila, and you can call anybody. You can call Trump at the White House. So that's why I
Well, I mean, Mexico's figured prominently a lot of your conversations over the years. And Primo, you decided to go back. Talk about why you went back. And you also fought for the vote abroad for Mexicans living in the U.S. And that kind of created a clash with Latino advocates in this country. Explain a little bit about that.
I was in Miss Sabbatical in 1994. I went to Mexico for a sabbatical. But at the beginning of 1994, as you remember, the Zapatista, the National Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, National Liberation Zapatista Army, came out. And that was something really huge for Mexico, and I believe also for many people in the States and other parts of the world, but certainly for Mexico. 3 months later, the PRI candidate for the presidency of Mexico, the PRI, the ruling party, the ancient ruling party of Mexico, well, its presidential candidate was killed. 7-8 months later, the general secretary of that party was also killed. And by the time the new president, Ernesto Zedillo, took over in December of 1994, the economy had a huge, tremendous collapse. It was called the tequila, or everybody in the world was afraid of the tequila effect. After seeing all that, I said, well, it is time for me to go back to Mexico. Mexico was about to sink, and I didn't want it to be enjoying good life, tequila, mezcal, good food at tequilas, enjoying these wonderful friends. I said, I need to be in Mexico, not to do anything special, but simply to be there, because I know Mexico was in sort of a deep crisis, but also with lots of potential for change. And I started working following Raul's steps for the rights of Mexicans abroad to vote. We needed every Mexican to think of Mexico, Mexicans in Mexico and Mexicans in other countries, mostly in the States, to get involved in politics. We needed new minds, new people, new way to look at democracy, a new path to change Mexico. That's why I got involved in the right of Mexicans to vote, even if they were living outside Mexico. It was not easy, but we did it, thanks to Raul, who's here. He used to be the father of the Mexican vote abroad. Now he's a grandfather.
Both good roles. I'm going to ask a few more questions.
Can I ask a follow-up to Primo? I mean, I'm curious, looking today with Trump in office, was it a mistake to focus so much on helping Mexicans in the United States to vote in Mexican elections? I mean, shouldn't they have been registering to vote, participating in the U.S. elections? Devil's advocate.
That was an argument we really consider. Why don't you tell Mexicans in the States to get citizenship and then to vote? If they live in the States, they should be actively in politics in the States, not in Mexico. Right. But also something that we saw with time was that once people get involved in politics, once people feel what voting is, once people feel a little bit of power as citizen, as a community, they really like it. So we thought if some people, if Mexican people are able to vote in Mexico, they will be able to get engaged in US politics, and the other way around. If they already involved in US politics, they'll be really happy to get involved in Mexican politics. So,
and also, there was also, wasn't there a true optimism, what did Alan Greenspan call it, almost an irrational exuberance about the future of Mexicans in the United States? I mean, in the 90s, I think many of us thought, boy, Mexicans in the United States are going to be all right. I mean, I don't think anybody in the 90s would have predicted the kind of division and hatred that we're seeing now in this time and age. I think most of us were. I was extraordinarily optimistic. In the early 90s, that's when I started doing work in Mexico. I spent half my time down there, and I just remember people being incredibly optimistic about the place of Mexicans in America.
yep.
Leading into what Primo was talking about, you've been heavily involved in getting out the Latino vote and looking back at this last election. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well,
What happened?
I'm, by the way, my wife accuses me of looking at every glass half full. We do have a couple of advantages that historically the Chinese have shown us work, which is our mobility and our fertility. One thing I can do is arithmetic, and our arithmetic will continue, is not going to be denied forever. And I remember back 20 years ago, people would talk about how you couldn't ignore the Chinese community because just by virtue of their size, and over time that came out to be, wasn't purely size of that population. But I still think that, like many things, whether it's immigration, many of these issues tend to be cyclical. Economics tends to be cyclical. I happen to think that overreach is happening, and there will be pushback on that. And so I think ultimately all of the things that are going on right now, I think in 5 or 10 years will change for the better. I'm hopeful.
One of the things is, I would like David to address this issue because he refused to become a U.S. citizen.
And you've talked about...
He was incredibly Mexican, saying, I would never be a U.S. citizen. I'm a Mexican. And look at him. Now he's...
I got putting him on the spot.
But one of the main reasons is because back then,
why don't you talk about it?
Back then, you were not allowed to have dual citizenship. So I was not prepared to give up my Mexican citizenship. That was the main reason. When that became not an issue, immediately I applied for my American citizenship. But that was the case of many friends, and still I have many friends living for decades in the United States. They still don't want to become American citizenship.
But let me ask you, David, you also, like many immigrants, have talked about going back to Mexico, and you really are seriously thinking about it. A lot of people talk about it, it never happens. Why, and will it happen?
Well, the older I get, the more frequently I ask that question. I really want to go back, because something very interesting happened to me. I spend more years in the United States than Mexico now, but I miss home every day. I wake up and I miss the tortillas from Guadalajara and the tortas and the friends, and But when I go to Guadalajara or Mexico and I spend time there, 5, 10 days later, I start to miss Philadelphia. So, it's a very awkward situation, but at the same time, it's beautiful. I really feel very lucky to have two homes, culturally and physically, and business-wise. Also, my business now allows me to continue to go back and forth. So I have enough things to do there and here. So it's a very interesting situation where you are in a situation like I am. But I still don't know where is the more comfort zone that I have. I feel very good in both sides. Yeah. With my kids, it's another story. They are more, they are Americans. They like to go there, but they not feel connected culturally like I do. Yeah.
So 1 foot on each side of the border, and that's how you've lived your life, Alfredo, and you'll be going back to reporting in Mexico after the book. With the recent killing, Javier Valdez, a very high-profile journalist in Mexico. What does that mean? You used to think if you had a U.S. passport, somehow that would offer you some sort of protection, that you wouldn't be a target because it would be too much trouble if you killed a U.S. journalist. But now what?
I thought we were going to leave this for the tequila section.
We're going to end on a high note, but let's talk about that, and then I'm going to ask Ken something to end, and then we'll get to your questions right after that.
I still think that as an American journalist, there's much more protection than our Mexican colleagues. I mean, Javier Valdez Cárdenas was probably the most high-profile journalist covering drug trafficking today, and it's staggering. I mean, it's stunning. And I think it woke a lot of people up on both sides of the border, thinking that if you were high-profile, recognized from both sides of the border, you would have some kind of protection. It does make me feel more vulnerable as a Mexican-American journalist, but I still think that my situation pales in comparison to what Javier faced. I mean, these are colleagues in Mexico. More than 100 have been killed since 2000.
This year alone.
This year alone, since March, 6, 7 have been killed. And so this is a very, very troubling time to be a journalist in Mexico. This week, 186 foreign correspondents sent a letter to President Peña Nieto asking for answers. And to my surprise, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but the Mexican government actually answered the request. And it's great to see that, but you also think of so many colleagues in Mexico who really, whose death remains unsolved and who have no answers.
We've talked about kind of the past and how we've gotten to this point, but looking ahead, and maybe this is a place to end, Ken, the future. I mean, talk to me about your daughter. I mean, she's great heritage, but also really embodies what the U.S. is about today.
Well, yes, and thanks. And so I do know this girl who was born in Philadelphia at the second oldest hospital in the United States. She grew up on a beautiful street, Delancey Street in historic Philadelphia. She went to a Jewish day school, a Presbyterian preschool, an Episcopalian lower and middle school, and a Catholic upper school. She's a captain of her golf team and has been playing golf in the oldest country club in America. Most people wouldn't think that that's a Mexican-American girl, but that's my daughter. Her parents were born in poverty. I was the first one in my family to go to college. Most of the immediate family members my wife and I have from New Mexico are still living on the edge of poverty. And so, I've been fortunate because of education to have some really amazing opportunities. In many ways, though, for me, it's easier than for my daughter because nobody expected anything out of me. My daughter, on the other hand, has lots of expectations because she's now had lots of privilege that many of us haven't had. But she's also extremely connected to her roots and works very closely with, in fact, she's starting a golf program at a very low-income Latino serving school in north central Philadelphia, and has been working very closely with them. So she's very connected. So I'm very again, I'm the half glass full guy, but when I see my daughter, when I see some of the students here, I think that's part of what feeds my optimism for the future of, and as, by the way, the college search process, she's a junior in high school, I have started this, when you start looking at the statistics of what Latino kids have been doing over the last decade, it's extraordinary. The places that they're in school all over the country, schools like this school, I look at these and I meet these kids all over the country, and I think we're really in a very good place.
Time for questions.
Can I just say something? I mean, I think the best part for me, being at the IOP was meeting a lot of these young Latinos, and again, feeling, after last November, feeling a little optimistic about the future. I mean, meeting people like, I don't know if he's here, but people like Jonathan, George, Enrique, and so many others. I mean, it just makes you feel like, okay, it's not all lost. Hanging out with these ambassadors, it really. I remember I called my editor. I said, "Look, I'm not going to finish this book in May as we promised, but I will assure you that it'll become a better story once it's all said and done, because I spent so much time with them."
And you know what, Alfredo and I spent some time together right after this election in New Mexico, and he will tell you, I'm a news junkie, I couldn't look at a newspaper or television news, not for days, for weeks, for a couple of months. The reason I'm optimistic is every day today, I pick up the paper and I giggle.
So raise your hand if you have questions, and we can keep talking while you raise your hands. Don't be shy. It's your chance to get these four in the same room and ask them whatever you want.
They're all shy.
To those making the first three questions, for those making the three first questions, David has a bottle of tequila.
So I have a question back to the status of journalists in both countries. In the United States, we complain a lot about how much access journalists have, to the point of now we have all this fake news and we don't even know if what we're getting to is how it's been filtered. And clearly in Mexico, there's just the danger of actually getting to the news. If you just had a moment to speak to the American public and explain to them some of the privilege that we do have in terms of access to the news, or maybe how we could use the ability and the freedoms that we have to improve it, what would you want to tell them?
I mean, I always think of, I've been in the U.S. for a year now, and I think of U.S. journalists as being under fire. But in Mexico, they're literally killing you. And you have regions, as a consequence, you have regions of Mexico where there's absolutely no news. They're called zones of silence, where even if you're depending on social media, the stuff may be alternative facts that are being sent out by cartels themselves, who are trying to control a certain region, certain communities. So I think, I mean, you can speak to this, I mean, as a journalist.
Well, I think that that's one of the reasons why there's a responsibility to go and tell these stories in Mexico. But I also think as you really have the key in your hand to go and support legitimate news sources and not spread the fake news. There is an effort now to kind of help people distinguish and have some sort of media literacy, because it became so confusing for a lot of people during the election. So I think you're asking the right questions, and if you can encourage others to ask the same critical questions, it'll make a difference. There's one over here.
Hi. My parents are Mexican immigrants, and something that I think I found very, something that made me optimistic is kind of the strong sense of community that I see with a lot of like Mexican immigrants in this country, especially around like when people experience hardship, for example, maybe like deportations. I've seen like a lot of Mexican communities come together and support one another in instances like that. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak from, this is an excellent example of kind of like the Mexican American community and mutual support, but maybe speaking a little bit more about how larger Mexican community and like support within the community can kind of continue to shape that Mexican American fabric, maybe even in like looking forward into more like the political arena in like 2018 and forward.
Okay.
First, I do think that not only the Mexican American experience, but I think a lot of it is an immigrant experience, but especially shown, I think, among Mexican Americans. Look, one of the biggest problems that I see in Philadelphia is the breakdown of the family, and so the absence of family units and the absence of responsibility to family, to neighbors, is part of what I see over and over as feeding, the sense that life doesn't matter. But when you look at the Mexican experience in America, even after a first generation, you look at a second generation, a third generation, you see families that continue to be cohesive. I happen to think that the Mexican family is one of the greatest resources for America, for precisely that reason. And it's no mistake, no accident that the number of Medal of Honor winners that we have, the patriotism that Latinos have. The National Council of La Raza had research done that showed empirically that the hardest working workers in America are who? Mexicans. And so you look at what we have and what we start with in America, and it's usually not very much. And then within a generation, you see extraordinary success. You see a lot of pain as well. But I think that maintaining, and I think that's a challenge for us. I think in an era of social media, and I think we have an awful lot of both cultural challenges now, because much of that closeness becomes harder to control when you have technology. Technology allows us to communicate, sort of, right? But the reality is, I think the cacophony of technology a lot of times makes it harder for us to actually talk to each other. We may post a lot of stuff on social media, but that doesn't necessarily create the experience of you getting to know somebody right next to you. I happen to think that we need to continue now to look for experiences. We don't have what the Israelis have, which is that everybody has to serve in the armed services there, right? That creates a bond, a closeness, and independence that we don't have in the United States as much anymore, because the military has, in many ways, in many places, become a class system. So I think we need to find ways to ensure that this kind of closeness that Latino, Mexican American in particular families have, that we can translate that and have that across other parts of our country. I think one of the things that we need to do, whether we're Mexican or not, whatever we are, we've seen the dangers in this last election of what happens when poor or lower middle class whites feel and are being shut out and feel that they're not participating. And so I think we as immigrants, we as people who've been fortunate to have some very good things happen to us, I think we need to reach out, even though some of these hands may be wanting to bite us.
Anyone else?
Question.
There's some over there.
Now, my grandfather immigrated from southern Italy a century ago, the poorest part of Italy with a high rate of illiteracy. And the newspapers that era characterized South Italians as being shiftless and disease-ridden, the same thing that's being recycled now. Now, what I find extremely discouraging is some of the leading figures that harass or roust Latinos out now are just 2 or 3 generations removed, like Lou Barletta from your state, Sheriff Joe Arpaio. I think that there's a lack of historical memory. And I think there should be more of an affinity between South Italians, have a lot in common with Mexicans.
I can comment on that. My wife, my first wife, is Southern Italian, and I saw the family how I always hear the stories over dinner. How they struggle, how they migrate, how they suffer to adapt to the American society. And it's just like a deja vu. It has so many similitudes with the Mexican community, what we live in right now. But going back to what our community has been doing, as the Italians did to the Philadelphia area in the early 1900s. Right now, for example, Philadelphia is one of the most respected culinary cities in the country. Just a couple of weeks ago, the James Beard Foundation named the best of the best on the restaurant industry, and Philadelphia pretty much took half of the rewards. And the most influential chefs in the city, they publicly recognized that it was impossible, it will be impossible for a restaurant industry to generate billions of dollars to survive without the labor of the Mexican community. That happens to arrive in the 1990s when this restaurant renaissance happened in Philadelphia. So if the early 1900s, the Italians arriving in the city and providing their incredible labor force to develop one of the most dynamic cities in those years. And now the same thing happened with the Mexican community, arriving this labor force that is, thanks to that labor force, we have one of the most influential cities, culinarily speaking, that generates a tremendous amount of money to the economy, not just the city, the state and the region.
Some more questions here.
So you talked earlier about, different ways to quantify being an American, like becoming an American citizen and all of that, but that's kind of like a certification, I feel like. What does it really mean emotionally to be an American to you? And also, is that something that's static, like once you feel like you're an American, that remains, that you feeling that way? Or is it, does it kind of ebb and flow? And why?
I feel very comfortable now. I fight for years and try to figure out where I belong. But I just really start to feel extremely lucky and comfortable being from this part of the world, that allows me to move very easy to the two cultures that I feel very attached to. It was a lot of guilt in the beginning, and not anymore. I really feel blessed that I have this bicultural position. Yeah.
So my favorite class in law school was taught by a brilliant mathematician named Jerry Newman, who then he's teaching now at Harvard Law School, and it was immigration law. And the reason I loved immigration law was because of the fundamental question of why should I have a different set of rights because I'm born on this side of this line and you're born on that side of the line, even though everything else is the same. And answering those questions and trying to come up with a set of rules, a set of norms that society orders itself. Now, ultimately, the practice of immigration law is completely different than the theoretical or the philosophical underpinnings of, how does a society order itself and how do you decide who's in and who's out of that line. But it gave me at least, and I think, we have I think everybody has kind of complicated immigration routes, right? Like I said, my family came through Mexico to New Mexico as Spaniards and married into, among other things, Indian families. And then in 1848 and 49, that part of the United States became, that part of Mexico became part of the United States. So I've always felt very American. I grew up, and part of my reconnection with these guys was because I didn't have that sense of rootedness with Mexico that they did. And when I met them, that's what caused me to really recognize what I was missing. And I was missing that. And so this experience, with these guys in particular, now, by the way, has connected me to Mexico. But by the way, when I started traveling a lot to Mexico, one of the things I found was I didn't have a lot in common with a lot of Mexicans, right? And a lot of the Mexicans that I was dealing with, I was doing work a lot of times with large companies, wealthy Mexicans. I thought some of the rudest, most offensive people in America, in the world, were Mexicans with money to other Mexicans. They were they were terrible. And so, so I
We're bad hombres.
Very bad hombres.
Very bad.
That's exactly right. But so to answer your question, in some ways it is static, right? If you have a passport, if you have a citizenship of a country because of our laws, you're not going to lose that unless you do a couple of things. So in some ways it is static, but I think it ultimately is what it means to you. I think, and I do think that, and also to the gentleman's question, because I do think that the people who are the most proud of being Americans tend to be the people who are naturalized in this generation, right? I've spoken at immigration ceremonies, and what I find is that the people who treasure that citizenship the most are the ones that had to work the hardest for it. Very often the ones that treasure it the least are the ones that didn't have to do anything except be born.
One of the things that perhaps happened to every generation of immigrants, or all national immigrants with different nationality, is when they're in the States, for instance, they do not feel welcome in the States. But they're not either liking their own country. They have left, Mexicans left to the States, it's like, okay, you belong to the States. And when they go back to Mexico, many are said bad names, bad things about it. There's lots of stereotypes in Mexico about immigrants, but things are changing. In the sense of, I belong to Mexico, I belong to the States. Mexican culture is mine, US culture is mine. A pyramid, Aztec pyramid is mine as much as the Statue of Liberty is mine. So the question of binationality or transnationality is really a matter of life. It's really coming into life for many people, especially young people.
Looking at me?
Students looking at you.
I always...
When I met him, he was very young. Also, and Ken Trujillo. I mean, they start calling me like uncle, tío, primo. They were kids. Now look at them.
I always think that one of the reasons I love living on the border is because I don't feel like I have to choose between either side. And yet, you do have to care about both because, I mean, we're neighbors. And, I mean, 30 years ago, before NAFTA, Mexico was a very nationalistic country. I think it's a country that's open, really, it's open up to the world, where you're allowed to be binational. I remember before the elections, I had decided I was going to let go of Mexico and end my apartment lease and so forth, and just let it go and dedicate myself to the United States. November the 9th, I'm calling people up and saying, you still want to rent this place? I need a roommate. But it's that sense, I think that's one of the unique things about Mexican migration is Mexico is always there, and there's always that conflict you're going to have. But I like David, I mean, I think I found the comfort zone. I found the sense of a sense of peace with both sides.
thank you for another great conversation. We've started, and there's plenty more to talk about, but we've run out of time. So we really appreciate you being here this evening, and thanks to all.
Thank you.